Welcome, everyone. Thanks for spending your Saturday morning or afternoon with us, wherever you happen to be. This webinar is the fourth and for now final presentation in our series of webinars, Mass Incarceration in the Pandemic, hosted by the UCLA Center for Social Medicine in the School of Medicine's Department of Psychiatry. Last April, we brought together a broad spectrum of scholars, doctors, activists, and public officials for a webinar discussion of the impact of COVID-19 in the context of mass incarceration during the early days of the pandemic. This spring, we have continued the discussion with a series of 3 follow-up webinars to assess what we have learned and where we are after this momentous year during which the pandemic has intensified the already severe health crisis in prisons and jails. In the first 2 sessions, we reviewed what has been happening in federal and state courts and what has been occurring in and out of clinical settings. You can find recordings of both sessions on the UCLA Center for Social Medicine YouTube page, which we will post in the chat. Today, we focus our attention on the current urgent political conjuncture here in LA County in a session we've titled Decarceration and Care, Transforming Los Angeles. In August 2019, the county's Board of Supervisors abandoned its $3.5 billion plan to build a new mental health treatment jail. The supervisors considered this decision an embrace of a new paradigm, moving towards community-based care and away from centralized carceral punishment. Since then, the county supervisors have convened an Alternatives to Incarceration Work Group, or ATI, which produced the report Care First, Jail Last. The supervisors also passed a motion to move forward with closing LA's antiquated and unconstitutional men's central jail. And they did not authorize the creation of new jail beds. Last fall, LA County residents also voted in a new progressive district attorney, George Gascon, who has promised to transform that prosecutorial office, and we passed Measure J, which amended LA County's charter to permanently allocate at least 10% of existing locally controlled revenue to community investment and alternatives to incarceration. This could raise close to $1 billion annually. The refrain, "Care not cages," has been unifying these efforts at system transformation and has mobilized multiple popular coalitions of community organizations advocating for mental health and decarceration reforms in Los Angeles. Our panel today will dive into the blood, sweat, and tears of the everyday crisis of mental health care, policing and abandonment to homelessness and incarceration of individuals with serious mental illness in Los Angeles, which is also occurring all across the United States. We are excited to have the valuable opportunity this morning to hear from frontline clinicians, advocates, and also from families who've lost loved ones to police violence. They will discuss the urgency of systems-level transformation and explain the context for how we got to the current state of affairs and where we need to go. Our diverse group of remarkable speakers will help us begin answering the question that so many in the country are struggling with. What could, will, and should a Care First LA County that prioritizes decarceration look like? And what will it take us to get there? And what contradictions and obstacles need to be overcome? We are honored to begin the roundtable webinar with the testimonies of 2 families who tragically lost loved ones at the hands of police officers. They are now bravely organizing for justice for people experiencing mental health crises. 2 family members of Marco Vazquez Jr., who was killed in October 2019, will speak first. They will be followed by the sister of Nick Burgos, who was killed by a sheriff in November 2020 while he was a patient inside LA County's Harbor Hospital. Community organizer and leader Mark Anthony Clayton-Johnson will then talk to us about the recent mobilization of the healthcare sector to support the decarceration of people with mental illness and about the ATI initiatives in which he has played a leadership role. Professor Joel Braslow of the UCLA Department of Psychiatry will give us the policy background in Los Angeles and the larger historical, structural, and political economic context, beginning with deinstitutionalization of state psychiatric hospitals in the United States, as well as the multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical corporation's transformation of mental health treatment, and explain how we got to where we are. Health and justice expert Leana Zúñiga will discuss the recent work of the ATI work group, as well as efforts to build alternative crisis response systems and to close men's central jail. And Dr. Susan Partovi, who delivers medical care to housing insecure individuals on Skid Row in the context of substance use and mental illness disorders, will give us a picture of her experiences as a practitioner and advocate in the street. Dr. Partovi is also convener of the Grave Disability Work Group that brings frontline clinicians and policymakers together each month to discuss ways of improving outreach and care programs and advocate for changes in laws and regulations. And finally, Eunisses Hernandez of La Defensa will close the panel presentations by explaining the movement behind and vision for Measure J in Los Angeles. We will be posting longer biographies of each of the panelists in the chat, but each of our panelists will begin with a brief 5 to 10 minute presentation based on their expertise and lived experience of these difficult questions. After we've heard from each panelist, we will shift to a moderated discussion. The panelists will be able to respond to each other's presentations, and we'll also take questions from the audience. So those of you in the audience, please feel free to contribute your questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. As you're listening to presentation discussion, you can post questions throughout the discussion, and we'll be collecting them. Your questions or comments will not be publicly posted, but we will be moderating them, and we'll do our best to field as many of them as we can. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our first two speakers. We have Cristina and Leticia from the family of Marco Vazquez Jr. and Maria from the family of Nick Burgos. Please, why don't you join us and we can start our discussion.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Cristina Vazquez, and this is my mother-in-law, Leticia Vazquez. And we wanted to share Marco's story today. So in 2012, Marco experienced his first psychotic episode, and he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, also with severe depression and mood disorder. Unfortunately, at this time that it happened, he was incarcerated, and part of his episode was that he believed that all of us were killed in very tragic ways multiple times. So he thought his parents had been killed, his brother had been killed, I had been killed. At the time, we only had 3 daughters. He thought that they had all been killed, all in very horrific ways, different ways. It didn't matter if he was talking to his mom on the phone or if she was actually physically in front of him, because they did allow for that to happen. He didn't believe it. It took 8 months for them to get him stabilized and on correct medication. When he was released in August of 2014, prior to him getting out, the psychiatrist was always in constant talks with my mother-in-law and letting her know the son that you had will be no longer. He's someone different. And, you know, kind of giving all of us a forewarning, and he's now changed and you need to be aware of A, B, C, and D. They gave us a list. Luckily, we got him connected to receiving care right away. And the initial place of treatment was telecare. And they had him assigned with a psychiatrist for the meds, a clinician for the therapy sessions, case managers to assist with helping him get back into the community and start working again. And they would actually have people come give him shots to help with the schizophrenia and other medications as well. And it was an adjustment, and he struggled for some time. He would say he didn't like how the medication made him feel. It made him have very low energy. He was very swollen. He was always very thin, and he prided himself in his physical appearance. And he was struggling because he looked swollen, and not the kind of weight gain that you get from just eating and not caring for yourself, but the kind of weight gain that you can tell when you're taking medication and it causes you to swell. He got a belly, his face was swollen, his hands were swollen. So on top of him knowing that he was now sick, he also dealt with the physical part of it, where I feel like his self-esteem at that point was so low. And then knowing he had just come out of being incarcerated, doing a 5-year term, he had built his career as a truck driver, but lost it when he went back in. So he literally came out with nothing. And I had just come across one of his posts not too long ago, and he talked about how when he was released, he was broken and lost. And fortunately, he was able to build himself back up again. He did have strong family support. We did our best to try to learn this new Marco, try to understand the medication, try to understand and be sensitive to his illness, which wasn't always easy, because like I stated earlier, he felt that we had all died. So this constant fear never went away of him thinking he was going to lose us again. And he would cry and tell me, I don't ever want to feel that. Obviously, I know it didn't really happen because you're all here with me, but I felt what I felt and it was real. So this constant fear that he dealt with daily was he was going to lose us again. So if any of us had to leave to run an errand or go to work, it was getting bombarded with phone calls by him because, are you okay? Where are you? What are you doing?
Times.
It was very common to get about 100 texts throughout the day, multiple phone calls if you didn't answer, and it was the paranoia because he didn't want to lose us. We ended up getting married in March 7th, the day before my birthday on 2015. And then we ended up welcoming two other kids, which were two little boys, Jackson, Mason, Vazquez, and so a total of 5 children together. And then we got blessed with 2 grandchildren. One he did not get to meet, unfortunately. Sorry. Both of us were, when we got together, we both didn't have anything because I had lost everything too. But together, we started our careers again. Everything that was taken from him when he was incarcerated in 2011, he got it all back. He got his career back. He got his family back. We were establishing our credit. We purchased our first car together. And we had 2 little boys in addition to our family. He missed so many milestones of his daughters, but he was able to attend each one of their high school graduations in 2015, 2017. Unfortunately, he made it to attend Raven's graduation in 2019. He became an owner operator, which was a dream of his. And for those of you that don't know what that is, he was a truck driver. So he was able to lease his own truck. He was making such good money. And I remember months before he passed away, we were in our room and we're just kind of getting ready, you know, for the work week, putting clothes away. And me and him are just having a conversation of, we can't believe how far we've come. We met when we were 13. We were teen parents. We got pregnant at 14 and had our first baby at 15. And I just looked at him and I said, babe, look at us. We were 2 little knuckleheads, 2 teen parents. And I know that there was people out there that thought we weren't going to be able to make it. And I said, we made it. We beat the odds. And I would always remind him what a miracle he was, because despite all of these things that he was facing, despite how hard, I can only imagine how hard life was for him because of the constant voices that he had in his head, we had made it. And unfortunately, he had stopped taking his meds for a while, and he started spiraling right around the time our youngest son was about to be born. And 2 months prior to our son's arrival, he started spiraling, and we were trying to get him help. On September 11th of 2019, we actually had to call the PET team out because he was under a severe psychotic episode. And I remember watching him at the door while the PET team, he didn't know the PET team was on their way. And this is one of the images that I carry with me daily. He's holding his head and he's screaming and he's looking at me and he's like, I'm so fucking tired. But he's screaming, holding his head like if he was in so much pain. He's like, I'm so tired of these voices. And I know that he was being tormented. I wanted to help him. I didn't know what to do to help him. All I knew was I need to call the professionals. Maybe they can help him. So they ended up admitting him. They put him on a 72-hour hold and they extended it to a 14-day. And I was in constant contact with the clinician or psychiatrist who was seeing him. And I have private insurance. I have Kaiser. So he was there with them. Unfortunately, my husband was very smart and very charismatic. So what he did is he filed a petition to go before the judge and ask to be released. I feel that the judge did not do his job. I don't think he looked at the chart well enough, really. He just looked at my husband and said, "You don't look suicidal to me. You're fine. We're releasing you." And I'll never forget the words of his clinician. He called and he said, "Ms. Vazquez, I'm so sorry, but the judge supersedes me. And even if I feel that your husband shouldn't leave, the judge cleared him. You need to come pick him up." And his last words to me were, "I'm so sorry, Ms. Vazquez. May God bless you and your family." So I picked him up, and on the drive home, he looks at me and he tells me, "You know, I think I should have stood longer." And I looked at him and I said, "Yeah, but at that point, there's nothing I could have done because you asked to be released." But I feel like it was the battle with the voices again. Like he knew he needed help, but at the same time, he's like, "I want to get out." So now fast forward to the night he was murdered.
He was feeling on the gym on that medication.
Oh, and also, I feel like they were overloading him on the medication because he would call and tell me he was drooling at the mouth. So at one point while he was on the hold, I had to call and tell them. I said, "You're over medicating him because he's feeling like he can't," like he was getting numb on his face, so he was drooling. And I'm like, "What are you guys doing to him? I know he needs help, but don't overdo it either." So he stopped taking his medication as soon as we picked him up, and then from there it just skyballed. So now fast forward to the morning of his murder, which was October 6th of 2019. I felt it, something was wrong and it wasn't okay. And so back and forth, he's pacing and he's not okay. And he just keeps saying, "You know, I'm going to take care of things." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" I had to drive our youngest daughter back to San Diego because she had just started school in San Diego. I dropped her off. By the time I come back, he's at the house and he's kind of making a scene because he really believes there's men in our home trying to hurt us. He himself called 911. At that point, I look at my mother-in-law. She's like, "I'm calling them to let them know he needs the pet team." Now we're familiar with all this. We know we call the pet team. Anyway, they come out with all their team. The clinician that showed up on site really didn't even take any initiative in talking to him and trying to assess the situation. She just said, "He's fine. He needs to sleep it off. Leave him alone. You guys should just leave him alone. He'll be fine." That was a total of 2 hours. So I'm sparing you guys all those details. After they leave, they clear out 20 minutes of that. He's still making statements. So my daughter says, "I think I need to call." And we said, "Go ahead and call." They informed us that the pet team was closed and they were going to send a patrol car to come assess the situation. I want to say 5-10 minutes after that call, they show up, and within 8 seconds of them showing up, Marco was dead. And they did it in front of his parents, his brother, myself, and our 2 oldest children. The second that he fell on the ground, my oldest daughter screamed and said, "It's my fault," because she's the one who made the call. And I see my second daughter run over to her dad, and she's holding his head and she has blood on her hands and is screaming, "Dad, please wake up." My mother-in-law threw herself on top of him to try to protect him, but it was already too late. And so I just feel like the system failed him in many ways. And those are the incidents that occurred for Marco.
Thank you, Christina. I mean, you really well pointed out so much there in that heartbreaking and detailed story about everything you guys were doing, a really inspirational story of everything you guys were doing for him. And then all the points where everyone was trying to get him help and the help he needed didn't come. And what did come was, exactly what nobody needed, disaster, the wrong response for the wrong situation, right? And it's exactly what kind of exemplary of what's wrong with our system. He wasn't getting enough help he needed for his mental health problems. But what he did get was, this kind of police response, criminal justice response, which is not what was needed. And thank you for you really eloquently pointed out all these details so well in that story. And I think it's just hard not to be affected by what you've shared. So thank you so much. And we also, I'd like to turn to Maria Burgos, sister of Nick Burgos, who many of you probably are aware of the story of Nick Burgos, who was tragically killed while he was an inpatient at Harvard, UCLA. So Maria, would you like to share with us a little bit about your story and Nick's story?
Well, I don't have a full story that I want to share. I just wanted to talk about him being in the hospital and that night that he was shot. I mean, I wasn't there, which was October 2020. And, we didn't know that he was shot. He had gone to the hospital, I believe it was that Saturday prior, which was October 5th. All I know was that my mom said that she took Nick to the hospital that day because he asked to be taken because he wasn't feeling himself, and he didn't want to hurt himself and he didn't want to hurt anybody. And he just begged her to please take him to the hospital. So my mom took him to the hospital that day. Prior to this, Nick had been dealing with mental health. Well, we didn't know it was mental health, right? We knew he was dealing with some stuff. Me, I was always trying to convince him to go to a doctor, go to a hospital, try to get help. And he refused to. But then when he came to me in March of 2020, he asked me if he can talk to me, and I said, yeah. And, he came and he sat with me. He was crying. And he would just tell me how proud he was of me because I had my life together. And, I had done a lot of things that I wanted to in life. And, he just felt like he was a failure and a burden to everybody because, he couldn't get straight. And, he just felt like he didn't belong here anymore. When I saw my brother that day, he was wearing long sleeve shirts, so I didn't notice really what was wrong with him. And he showed me his arms. He said, look, sis, look what happened. And I said, what's that? And he said, he just said, well, he said, I really don't belong here. He's like, and I was trying to make sure that, you guys didn't suffer or anything. And I was just trying to leave on my own. So when I saw his arms, he had 2 big slits down his arm. He had attempted suicide. He showed me his paperwork. He was in the hospital for 14 days. We didn't know about this. My mom didn't know. And she was the one seeing him and going to the hospital to see him and stuff. And so then after that, I told my brother, that he can stay with me. He can stay in my house. He had lost his job. He lost his apartment because he couldn't afford rent anymore. And then, well, with the pandemic happening, his job, he was a mover and, helping people move from home to home. So his job pretty much closed down, the company. And so he didn't have anywhere to go. So I accepted him in my house. And, after that, it was like everything went downhill with him because, he just wanted, he wanted help, but he was embarrassed. He's a man. It's very hard for a man to actually say, I need help, you know, I'm having these type of issues and I'm hearing stuff, you know, there's voices, you know, sometimes he'll come to the back and tell me, hide. And I'm like, why? Someone's coming to kill you, or, you know, someone's coming to hurt me. And he'll literally sit in a corner inside the house and start crying because he thought someone wanted to hurt him. And sometimes, like, I even felt dumb because I would like run outside to go see who's out there or to see what's going on, because I was like, what the hell's going on? Like, what's wrong? And I would go check and see, and I'm like, Nick, nobody's out there. Yeah, they're right there. And, you know, sometimes he'll tell me he saw like green little people or whatever. And I was like, no, Nick, there's nothing there. You know, we need to get you help. And, you know, I started taking him to Harbor UCLA, you know, and trying to find programs for him so he can get that help. And, you know, he let me, he let me take him. I took him a few times. You know, I would sit there with him as they were talking to him. And he started going to a psychiatrist. He would go, I think, 3 times out of the week. I know they medicated him. I didn't really know what they actually diagnosed him with. I know he was under medication. The medication did make him very groggy, sleepy. He was always sleeping. He stopped eating. You know, sometimes I would have to hide the medicine from him so he can wake up and eat. You know, I would like literally sit here with my brother and like feed him in the mouth because he just didn't want to eat. And he would tell me like, just leave me alone, like, let me die. And I'd be like, no, you know, like, come on, like, you need to try, you need to get up, you know, come on. You know, I would take him, his favorite place was the beach. You know, I would take him to the beach, you know, let's go walk in the beach, you know, let's go do something. And, you know, that was the way I try to help him. I did call suicide prevention lines and stuff and try to get more information. I wanted to get him in a program, specifically one in Pasadena, but I didn't, during that time, I didn't even like call or whatever. I was just trying to see how he was going to do with the hospital and everything. And, you know, I kind of regret him going to the hospital because it was my idea. You know, I wanted him to get that help there. And when he went, you know, on his own to try to get help, you know, he ended up getting shot about 7 or 8 times. And I really think that's really shitty that somebody goes to get help in a hospital. You would think that you're going to be safe in there and where nothing is going to happen to you and they're going to help you. And then you end up dying in the hospital because, you know, somebody didn't understand that you were going through something. You know, the sheriff, she was advised before anything when she even walked into his room and tried to go talk to him or tell him anything. She was advised that, you know, Nick is a mental health patient and that she needed to leave because there was a team coming down already from the 4th or from the 5th floor to the 4th floor, and that she just needed to leave. I don't know what happened during that part there, but, you know, she ended up shooting my brother.
Maria, thank you so much for sharing that really painful and difficult story. I mean, I just hear it loud and clear. You were doing so much to help him. He was trying to get help. You guys were doing everything you should and could do, and you were doing the right things. And the fact that it's just hard to believe that in seeking care, he was killed. I mean, I just want to say, you did nothing wrong, you know, and that's to both of your families. I think one of the things, Christina, you mentioned how your daughter felt it was her fault, I think. And Maria, how you just said you felt it was your fault. You know, it's not your guys' fault. We've let you down. Our psychiatric system, our medical system, our you know, criminal justice system, public safety system, that's what let you guys down. Just listen to your story. You guys were clearly doing everything you could, doing, you know, to care for your, you know, your loved ones, you know, these men who wanted help. And I think this is a great way to open this discussion. It's difficult, it is to hear. And thank you so much, you guys, for sharing. You know, again, I'm a psychiatrist, and I see, I have a lot of my patients are a lot like Nick and Marcos, and I think you guys just so eloquently and so, you know, you really stated these stories, and you pointed out all these tragedies. Not the care that they probably would have helped them wasn't there. All they were getting was this medication that wasn't perfect. It wasn't always helping, but nobody knew what else to do, and there was nobody there. So number one, we need better systems of care, better systems of mental health care. Number two, you guys, you families, it's inspiring to hear what you guys did. We need to support these loving families better, because we know that's what helps people get better, is the support of their families. And you know, and then lastly, we need to be able to provide help in emergencies and crises. When the families, again, I'm gonna say, you guys did so much to help Nick and Marcos, everything I would have ever asked you guys to do as a psychiatrist. And then you asked for help when you saw you needed it. And that's what you're meant to do, that's what you're supposed to do. And again, we let you down. You got people, you got, you know, cops with guns when you needed someone with open arms, someone with care, someone with love, someone with support, right? And that's what today is all about. And that's what we're really, everyone here on the panel is trying to move towards, building this system that can offer support.
Yeah, and if I may add something, that we were, and we have been built to trust our hospitals, our doctors, our policing agencies and government, etc. And we did exactly what we were trained to do or raised to do or taught to do. We trusted that they were going to help us. Unfortunately, both of us, families, we put the trust where we were taught, and they both failed us. They all failed us.
Yeah, we let you down. I think as a society, we let you down. Our systems let you down. And thank you so much for being a part of the effort to try to make things better.
Thank you.
And thank you for being here with us, sharing your pain with us. It really, I think it means a lot to all of us who benefited from hearing these stories. And I think it sets a great tone for the rest of our discussion.
Thank you.
And so thanks. We'll return, I think, to a lot of this in our discussion. And we can, I think, let's move on to our next speaker, Mark Anthony Clayton-Johnson.
Hey everyone. I just wanted to open up by saying to the family of Marcos Vazquez, Christina, and Leticia, to the family of Nicholas Burgos, Maria, just, I see you. You know, I usually start by introducing myself and talking about our organization, but it becomes really hard when you hear the really devastating stories, the stories that have fueled our work, certainly, the Frontline Wellness Network, the stories that are fueling a lot of work on the ground right now, and is the source of so much change. But I just feel like it's important to acknowledge that. So my name is Mark Anthony. I'm the founder of the Frontline Wellness Network. And you know, our organization is really trying to build a network of providers, clinicians, researchers, medical students who understand that there is a crisis, a public health crisis, an existential crisis that looks like criminalization and incarceration. And you know, I'm again really struck by what for me feels like at least one of the messages of the stories that we just heard, which is that health is not a neutral or politically neutral arena. That really health, the way I like to think about it, is that health is the outcome of political struggles that have been waged on our lives or for our lives. And for at least the last 50 years, there's been a political agenda to demonize, to blame, to create fear and disdain of Black and brown people, certainly of Black and brown folks with mental health disabilities. And instead of meeting us with care, meeting us with control, meeting us with violence. And Los Angeles is one of many ground zeros for that, right? Folks may know, but we're in a pretty important watershed moment right now where a lot of things have been won in the last couple of years. A $4 billion mental health jail, and the contract to build that jail was canceled because of almost a decade of work by organizers and families and folks like Christina and Leticia and Maria. A women's jail that was slated to be built in Los Angeles County was paused and stopped. A alternative plan that took a year to create and was approved by our county board of supervisors that says instead of building jails, we're actually going to create an alternative system that is trying to reduce the imprint and impact and footprint of incarceration and policing in our people's lives. And we're going to do that by building up care. Right? We're going to build up a care ecosystem. We're going to build up more urgent care centers, more immediate responders, more avenues for people to get care prior to police contact, and thinking about the ways in which we reduce and get rid of police contact in our lives, because it has never resulted in something positive. And yet what strikes me about this moment, as historic as it is, as unprecedented as it is, as the ways in which it is literally reshaping Los Angeles. I mean, I say this often, but it really does feel like a metric for me that I have a 17-year-old child, and it's pretty incredible that she might grow up in a Los Angeles where Men's Central Jail doesn't exist, where billions of dollars have gone into a vicious dungeon that has been kept alive for years, may actually be able to go somewhere else. But just saying that we're going to invest in care is simply not enough. It's just simply not enough. And the stories of Maria, the stories of Leticia and Christina that were just shared show us that, right? Show us that what our county has done. It has said that in order to reduce incarceration and policing in our communities' lives, we have to increase care and increase care infrastructure and workforce and funding and those things. But what I do not feel we have adequately done is really interrogated the ways in which our care system is entangled and is actually a vector for incarceration and policing in our people's lives. And I think you just heard that very clearly. And so we're in this really important inflection point where we not only have beaten back a large coalition, the JusticeLA coalition, the Reimagine LA coalition. So many folks have been fighting hard to turn Los Angeles in a very different direction. And now we're in the place where we've stopped some terrible things from being built. We've devised some plans to build some things that are important, that communities have been calling for, but then now it needs to be implemented. Now it needs to touch the ground. And we don't think it's possible to do that unless we reallocate significant amounts of resources away from our sheriff's department, away from probation, into the lives, into the workforce, into the consciousness that is going to keep our people safe and keep our people alive. The challenge that I want to offer us as providers is just to say that this is not the time for middle ground solutions. We have really, the Care First Jail Last report that was approved really lays out some pretty courageous reinvestments that could be made. But those reinvestments have to be made by reducing the systems that harm us. And so when I say that the idea of middle ground solutions, I'm talking about more training for law enforcement will never be the solution. The Sheriff's Department has gotten increased training, increased mental health training, increased crisis response training for the last decade. And certainly since I've been organizing to stop human rights violations by the Sheriff's Department in 2011, it's been about 10 years, and tremendous work has been done. Tremendous shifts have happened. Things that are shifting power away from that department and into the hands of people is happening. And yet the sheriffs killed roughly the same number of people last year that they did 10 years ago. And so the ideas of training, the ideas of positioning them to be co-responders, the ideas of positioning sheriffs to take on the role of social workers or service linkage folks and those type of things has failed. And I think the stories that you just heard demonstrate that, and there are so many other stories. And so it's important to acknowledge that we have lost so many lives on the middle ground. We have lost so many of our loved ones on the ground that we should have faith, and as Christina and Leticia and Maria named, that we should trust the progress of these systems that inherently are designed to harm us. That is their goal. And the goal of the folks on this call, the goal of folks here at UCLA and the goal of the care workforce is one that is fundamentally rooted in the principle of do no harm. And so what we're saying is that principle has to extend beyond the treatment room, beyond the one-to-one relationship, and into challenging systems. And for us, the most powerful mechanism we can use to challenge those systems right now is to divest from the Sheriff's Department, divest from the Department of Probation, and invest in our families, invest in solutions of care. And I'm really excited that folks like Diana Zúñiga are here. They can talk directly to that. Folks like Eunisses Hernandez is here. They can speak directly to that. But I do think it's important to just say, as you're hearing the things that they're talking about, that we have to do a really diligent job of wrestling our care spaces away from the carceral logic that has dominated Los Angeles. Thinking about the ways in which we remove sheriffs and the reach of sheriffs in our care settings. Thinking about the way we remove the possibilities that getting care will result in your Fourth Amendment rights being violated, your right to protection from unlawful search and seizure, your right to protection from unlawful detainment, your right to protection from torture and punishment and death. The reality is the way that our health policies are structured, the way in which our Sheriff's Department is given a tremendous amount of reach into our care settings, the ways in which care workers are taught to defer to law enforcement produces the very harms that we're hearing this morning. And we have been in a really intense push right now to eliminate the contract between the Department of Health Services and the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. And if you look at that contract, if you look at the way it's written, if you look at the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding that links the two organizations, you see how much room the sheriff has to violate HIPAA laws, to violate the rights that I just named. And it's a lot of that that was just named that we are trying to peel our care settings away from. And that happens because us as healthcare providers, clinicians, folks who are in this care workforce are taking courageous stances. And so we need you. We need you to take those stances. The other thing I want to say, that having a progressive worldview is simply not enough. Having a progressive politic is simply not enough. Creating progressive solutions is simply not enough. We actually have to create solutions that fundamentally change power. And that specifically target the communities we want to thrive and to live, right? And the clearest example of this, last year when COVID hit, many of us organized very quickly to pressure the county and said, look, one of the worst places for someone to be during a pandemic is in a jail or a detention center. And we need to get people out as quickly as possible. And we saw unprecedented releases. Our jail population between March and August dropped roughly 5,000 people, right? And what disturbs me about that really unprecedented victory is that the folks who were least likely to benefit from those releases were Black folks. Even though Black folks are 8% of our county population, 30% of our county jail population, and 43% of our county jail mental health population. And so we have to take courageous stances that are very specific about Black well-being. We have to take courageous stances that are specific about wresting power away from the sheriffs and probation and into the hands of Black and brown families. And I hope that you will join us in doing that. I'm going to drop a link in the chat that you can use to text our platform, because we want to hear from y'all. How do we address root causes of incidents where law enforcement are utilized in our care settings, and what are the root strategies we can use that are not law enforcement? It's just important for you to know that over the next 3 weeks, our Department of Health Services and our county board of supervisors are going to approve a budget that is going to determine what our next year resources are going to look like. And we believe that that budget should include a significant amount of millions and millions of less dollars, billions, in fact, and we've laid it out and we'll share it with you, less dollars for those carceral and vicious systems and into the systems of care, into the families that you just heard, and into some of the strategies that you'll hear from Diana and Eunisses as well.
Thanks, Mark Anthony, for kind of laying out where we are and some directions forward. Our next speaker, Joel Braslow, is going to provide a sort of historical context of mental health policy and fill us in a little bit on why we are in the situation we are in. Joel?
Great. Am I on? I'm not seeing myself. But,
yes, yeah,
oh,
you're on.
Great. Thank you so much. Guys, it's hard to follow all of you. And especially I apologize in advance in some sense, because a lot of what I'm going to try to just do a really kind of whirlwind history from, over the course of the 20th century, what's happened to care in, for serious mental illness and how that intersects with our current problem of mass incarceration and homelessness. And so I want to give a brief overview. And what I kept thinking is how to best contextualize what I want to say. And I think in part, it's a story of the destruction of the state welfare system and kind of rise of neoliberalism. But it also it's a story that hopefully will illustrate how our current crisis that we're in is a consequence not of the nature of serious mental illness, but much more so a consequence of historical forces and political and economic forces that have transformed the ways in which we understand and treat serious mental illness. And so with that, I hope it gives, what motivates what I'm going to say is really trying to make sense out of how we got to this world where people who are in most need of consolation, of care, and we've transformed, either abandoned them or criminalized what I see is really a symptom of psychiatric illness often. So let me see if I can, I'm going to share my screen so I can give some slides. I want to make sure, let me just do the slideshow part. Sorry about that. There we go. So I was just thinking of what I was going to talk about today, and it really, it's the title of of our panel is Decarceration and Care, and this is a history that I was the deinstitutionalization and abandonment is the last 60 years of this history, I think, and has led us to this point. I think what I want to emphasize is that the world was much different 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and we did, regardless of kind of the quality of care individuals did receive in these massive institutions called state hospitals, is that everyone was provided care. These are much more, they embodied small cities essentially, where people were given activities and that were seen as integral to their care and treatment. And I just, to show, like, this is just one little quote from a superintendent in 1950, but it does such a nice job of encapsulating what was seen as necessary for caring with people with serious mental illness. And the superintendent says everything done to, for, and around a mental patient can be considered as therapy. I don't want to idealize these institutions, but nevertheless, they weren't carceral, and in essence, they were attempting to care for individuals. And psychiatric illness up until the 1970s was seen much more in a kind of holistic sort of way, in which illness was seen as a consequence of both the social world and one's psychological world, as well as biology. And just to give you an example, this is an example of beauty shop therapy in the 1950s, seen as a therapeutic intervention, and it underscores kind of the nature that illness and its treatment involved a large array of interventions. This slide here, and now I apologize beforehand that you're going to see a lot of a number of just data slides, but this is just to show the decline in overcrowding in state hospitals. So ironically, conditions improved dramatically prior to the massive deinstitutionalization that would begin in the mid-1950s. And this is simply to underline that conditions had, in terms of overcrowding in these institutions, improved quite dramatically following World War II. So this slide is kind of the most critical slide in terms of just showing the massive both rise of state hospital population and then the really rapid decline. And what I want to emphasize is that the rapid decline had much more to do with policy decisions and the larger political economic context following from the 1960s onward than any sort of psychiatric interventions. And this is just to show how state hospital budget in California declined quite precipitously after, and you can see, from the mid-1960s onward. And so much of deinstitutionalization involved shrinking state budgets and closing in, the hospitals themselves. I'm throwing this slide in, and it's a little confusing, but I just want to show that this is comparing how long patients would be in a state hospital in California on antipsychotic drugs. Psychotropic drugs antipsychotic drugs were discovered in 1950. They were introduced into state hospitals in the mid-1950s. And all of this is simply showing is that even if you were to get an antipsychotic drug, it's not a well-controlled study, but what it is showing is that individuals on antipsychotic drugs were likely to stay in the hospital longer than those who weren't on antipsychotic drugs. This is just to show that we get, in psychiatry especially, we confuse cause and effect often. And what this slide is, what we're looking at is the use of antipsychotic drugs from their introduction to the mid-1980s. And we increasingly escalated our dose of drugs, confusing sort of the efficacy of these drugs to trying to get patients out of the hospital as quickly as possible. And the purpose of showing this is that social forces were dictating our use of antipsychotic drugs, and that as we tried to get patients out of the hospital more quickly, that we started escalating our use of drugs. And I just this is from an advertisement one is from 1958, the other one is from 1975. And all this is meant to show is that if the 1958 ad for an antipsychotic drug is showing how the drug worked in this kind of much larger context. And from the night, and increasingly as we shortened hospital stays, we became increasingly dependent on antipsychotic drugs. So our vision of what counted as psychiatric disease becomes increasingly narrowed. And this ad just sort of encapsulates the view that all that really counts in patients with serious mental illness are they're treating their symptoms without regard to the rest of their social context. But what had the largest impact on decreasing state hospitals was the passage of Medicaid and Medicare, which allowed states to shift the burden from the state to the federal government in terms of care for people with serious mental illness, and at the same time accelerated moving people out of state hospitals. Simultaneously, and it's so impossible to disentangle the two, and that with the institutionalization, even the idea of criminalization of mental illness first appears in the early, in the late 1960s, early 1970s. This is an article from California, from a study in California in 1972. And it's one of the first kind of recognition that individuals with serious mental illness were increasingly being caught up in the carceral system rather than in the treatment system. This is a slide just showing the kind of massive shift from individuals with serious mental illness being incarcerated. And you can see that it kind of following deinstitutionalization in the mid 1960s, and there's a substantially rapid increase. And this slide, again, is to look, and it's really remarkable how the transformation, and you can see how with, and this, the green is the rates of institutionalization, of incarceration, and the, and this line here is, and I'm almost done, is the decline in state hospital populations. This is a slide showing the increase in individuals in Twin Towers with serious mental illness, and you can see it's just this progressive increase. And then finally, homelessness, and you can see homelessness rising quite rapidly in LA County. And then finally, and this is my last slide, is just to show how the treatment system, state hospitals treatment system has transformed largely into a forensic system as well. So that even the state institutions that had once cared for people were as civilly committed are now almost entirely forensic institutions. And that's all. I'm done. Oh dear, I'm not hearing you.
Yeah, I was muted. Thanks, Joel.
Sorry for the rapidity of this little tour, but
no, it's great. I think you really demonstrated why it is that patients of ours, like Nick, like Marcos, all they were done is offered medication when they were in crisis, right? They weren't offered therapy. They weren't offered groups. They weren't in residential care. They weren't in intensive day treatment programs. They were offered medication, and our system's been sort of systematically cut down to that over the years. So we'll return to that in the discussion. I just wanted to introduce our next speaker. If you mind stopping the share, Joel, for your slides. And then our next speaker is going to be Diana Zúñiga.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And I just want to, I'm still feeling Leticia, Cristina, and Maria. So I just want to let you all know, still feeling you all, sending you so much love, and burning some sage over here for Nick and Marcos. May they rest and rise in the arms of the ancestors. So thank you so much for sharing their story. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here in community. My name is Diana Zúñiga, and I am a health and justice and healing kind of expert and organizer and consultant. I've been working within this issue professionally for about a decade, and kind of organizing around creating alternatives to incarceration, stopping jail and prison expansion, and really shifting all of the resources into what our communities actually need. I started, getting involved in this work because from the age of, being an infant, I saw every male in my family member cycle into the system. I grew up on the southeast side of LA, and I remember seeing my father, all of his brothers, my mother's brother, constantly harassed, my grandfather harassed by law enforcement, by the sheriff's department specifically, in the area that I grew up in. I saw them cycle in and out of incarceration because of mental health needs, because of trauma that was not met with support and services. And so for me, it was really important to begin working in this issue to see how I could support my family, but also how I could create, be a part of creating a system that actually centered care and centered support and centered connection, as opposed to isolating our loved ones from us by incarcerating them in facilities that only further traumatize them, and hospitalizing them in places that would eventually 2 days later let them out without informing us. So I have seen the cycle within multiple generations of my family, and I'm here to kind of lift that up, but also talk about the concrete ways that we're attempting to shift that. I also just want to root in the fact that this happens because our systems are racist. And at the end of the day, if we don't start interrogating the fact that we live in a white supremacy culture that allows for these systems to not actually care for Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, then these solutions that we're creating aren't going to go anywhere, because they're going to be developed and implemented by people that still center racial harm. And so I just want to lift that up, because when we're talking about these things, we're talking about the fact that they're manifestations of colonization, slavery, and continuous harm to, again, communities of color. So I'm going to go back and tell us a little bit about the history of why folks continue to fight against these systems. I'll share a little bit of the slides, and hopefully I can get through most of them. Please, folks, alert me if I'm taking too much time. All right, hope you all can see that. Oop, did not want to share. Present. Okay, so I just want to show this particular slide because I think it's really important to share this, because, the history of, I really appreciated the presenter before sharing the history of how, mental health, the institutionalization of mental health was dwindled. And what that then resulted in was the development of a carceral state that was basically the solution to issues of mental health, to issues of substance use, to issues of trauma. And so I share this slide so that folks can see the way that that has actually physically emerged in California. This is an image of all the state prisons, federal prisons, private federal prisons, county jails, and youth facilities that exist in our state. And so this is not only the manifestation, again, of slavery, colonization, and continuous harm of people of color, but this is also the manifestation of decades of tough on crime legislation, like mandatory minimums, like the third strikes law, which one of my uncles is inside for, and like the drug war that has primarily targeted Black and Brown people. Now I'm just going to share an image of LA because I think it's important to then hone in on how that then manifests in Los Angeles County. I put City of Inmates, which is a book that is written by one of my mentors, Dr. Kelly Lytle Hernandez. I encourage you all to read that book. It talks about the decades of how the rise of incarceration has actually been created in Los Angeles County. And it talks about the resistance that has existed from Indigenous, Black and Brown people for decades. And you'll see that in the book. So I think it's really important to read that, to center in how mass incarceration has risen up in Los Angeles County and how there have always been rebels and people that have been impacted by the carceral system that have continued to push back. Additionally, Dr. Kelly Lytle Hernandez and a team at UCLA created the $1 Million Hoods Project. This was actually birthed out of a meeting that actually myself and Mark Anthony were at in 2017, 2016, something like that. And it was because we couldn't tell how much was being spent on incarcerating individuals. And so what Dr. Kelly Lytle Hernandez and her team did was they submitted public records requests to the sheriff's department in order to get the data that would allow us to understand how people were being targeted in neighborhoods across Los Angeles County. This image is a snapshot from $1 Million Hoods, which you can also look up and see how much is being spent in your neighborhood to arrest and incarcerate people. But this image, every neighborhood in red, there's more than $1 million being spent in that neighborhood, again, to arrest and incarcerate individuals, both from, this is an image from the sheriff's department, but you could also explore how that is being impacted through the LAPD, through LAPD law enforcement. So we live in this climate, again, a climate that is rooted in white supremacy culture, a climate that has continuously on the backs of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people generated a system that is a carceral system that does not support. However, people have continued to fight back. And so you'll see on the right side, these are images of consistent actions that we have had since 2010, 2012, to really push back against any sort of carceral expansion in Los Angeles County. I know this is a lot of words, but I'm going to try to move us through a little bit of history because I think a lot of folks are really aware of what has happened in the last 3 years. However, there has been a movement that has continued to scaffold a foundation to allow for a different alternative vision, a care first vision to actually be created and generated and dreamed of. So I want to go back to 2011. In 2011, that was the implementation of realignment. At that time, the state prison system was actually in a lawsuit, the Plata-Coleman lawsuit. And that was because there was one person dying a week in the California state prison system due to inadequate medical and mental health care. The way that the state answered that was they built another prison, the Stockton Medical Facility, that had a lot of issues. You can research that and hear more about what the issues were there. And that was supposed to provide adequate mental health care and health care inside of the prison system, which we know does not exist. And what they also did was they implemented public safety realignment, which shifted people with nonviolent, non-serious, non-sexual offenses to county responsibility as opposed to state responsibility. Along with that came billions of dollars to counties to build jails. At that time, I was working with Californians United for a responsible budget. And we saw at least $4 billion of jail and prison construction funding that was approved. We also stopped $4 billion of jail and prison construction funding. At the end of the day, it resulted in 41 out of 58 counties attempting to build new jails at that time. There was a huge effort, a statewide jail fight work group that was generated and local jail fights that had been created to really push back and create an alternatives to incarceration vision instead. With that, some of what came up was we stopped, we actually shifted a lot of things around the jail. So at first they wanted to build a women's jail at Pitches Detention Center. We stopped that. Then they shifted it to Mira Loma Detention Center. And then at another point, that's when they added that they would do something with Men's Central Jail because they didn't agree to close it at that time, but they added that they would build another facility for people with mental health needs in Los Angeles County. That resulted in the $3.7 billion jail plan in LA County that, again, you can see in this timeline in 2019, we defeated. Between that, I say these two pieces, these two programs within the county were created. Office of Diversion and Reentry was created in 2015, and Whole Person Care was created in 2019. I elevate those two programs because those were the two programs, I would say, in the county that allowed for us to start imagining how we were going to divert people with mental health needs, and also how we were going to support people in the community that had substance use needs, housing needs, prenatal needs, et cetera. And so this is just a little bit of the timeline. And then I just want to also share, like, the Alternatives to Incarceration work group moved next. And from there, we created a reentry health advisory collaborative of 11 formerly incarcerated people to provide feedback to the county. Mark Anthony talked a little bit about this already, but in 2020, when COVID hit, there were multiple things that happened, including a reduction of the jail population work group, an alternative crisis response work group, and the opportunity to reassess AB 109, public safety realignment, which I talked about earlier. I know Eunisses will talk a little bit more about Measure J, so I'm not going to go into that, but that really funneled us into being able to start the conversation around closing Men's Central Jail. I'm going to share 2 more slides because I think my time is potentially up. I want to share this slide because this was what people imagined. So this is a community engagement event that we had in for the Alternatives to Incarceration work group. We had this one in Long Beach, and you can just see exactly what the community wanted, what types of alternatives they wanted. And then finally, I'm going to share this. This is the ATI Intercept roadmap. This is the alternative roadmap. This is not really how the system works right now. This is how people imagine the system could work instead, and at every point, how we could divert people out of the actual carceral system. And I'll just share these. This is a list of the alternatives within the county. I won't go into them, but you can see Care Transitions is there, and there's a lot of tools to be able to navigate how to actually get people out of the system and get them the actual services and support they need. So thank you all. I'm gonna stop sharing.
Thanks, Diana, and thanks for laying out the scaffolding, the history of the activism that's really started to change things, and also for centering, like you said, the role of colonialism, slavery, racism, and racial capitalism in getting us here. I'd like to turn now to our next speaker, Susan Partovi, who's got a lot of on-the-ground experience confronting a lot of these issues. Susan?
Hi. Oh, this is weird. I can't see everybody. Anyway, my name is Susan Partovi. I'm a family physician, and I've been doing street medicine since 2007, but specifically working with the housing insecure since 2003. I started the first street medicine team, and now there's scores throughout the county. And the one thing that has always stuck with me since day one is working with people with severe mental illness, psychotic disorders, and so I've been writing a lot about my experiences with them, and then just within the last few years have been working with other people in trying to understand the laws and somehow advocate for policy change as well as resources. I do have to say that when I do see someone on the street who is obviously severely mentally ill, who obviously cannot take care of themselves, it really breaks my heart. And the first thing I think of is what if this was my brother? What if this was my son? What if this was my mother? And so hearing the stories that Leticia and Christina and Maria told really brings that home, because I think when we hear it on the news, you know, so and so was shot, you know, you kind of go, oh, that's a bummer. But when you really go through, when you really experience it with them as they're telling their story, it really reminds me that yes, this is our brother, this is our husband, this is our son, this is our daughter, these are our family. And you know, I actually I was on Skid Row yesterday, where I would say is probably the most dense area of those who are not only housing insecure, drug use, but severely mentally ill. You can't walk a half a block without seeing someone who is exhibiting symptoms of severe mental illness. And we actually saw one yesterday, like within 10 minutes of walking. And, you know, he was young, he was probably in his 20s, he was filthy, he had no shoes, he had no belongings, and he was just standing there. And my first thought, even before hearing Leticia and Maria's and Christina's story, was that I'm old enough to be this guy's mother. What if this was my son? And I actually had a California state senator with me, and I pulled him over and I said, this is not okay. And most likely he will be hurt severely because he doesn't have the wherewithal. He wasn't with anyone to have his back. And or he'll be picked up by the police. And that's just a scenario I see over and over and over again. I work in the Skid Row area at Homeless Healthcare's Center for Harm Reduction. And its main draw is a needle exchange for injection drug users. Most of them are living in the streets of Skid Row, but I would say at least a third of those that I see just there have severe mental illness issues that I try to address, you know, kind of in my little urgent care clinic, to the point where I know that they're not gonna get to the downtown mental health, which is only 6 blocks away. You know, through the outreach teams, we've really really tried to find the most frail, fragile people that we see. But really our hands are tied when we see someone so severely mentally ill and they've been there for years, and they, you know, pee and poop in the corner 2 feet from themselves, and they're covered in lice and scabies, and and you know, many of them don't get picked up by the police, and they're just there minding their own business, suffering, and our hands are tied because the laws don't allow us, both the law and the resources don't allow us to take care of them the way we want to, or the way I think we should. And so it's one spectrum of the population suffering from psychotic disorders, right? Not all of them are living in the streets, but many are. And so we've been working to somehow, like, the law actually says that we can hospitalize people against their will if they're unable to provide for food, clothing, or shelter. But that's usually not the case. And I'm not saying that hospitalizing someone against their will is the way to go. But sometimes especially, especially in the past, it has been the only way to actually get stabilization. One thing we are doing is well, me personally, I'm trying to get as many of the primary care clinicians who are out on the street to basically beef up their psychiatric knowledge and start treating people on the streets. And we've actually found that once we've developed a relationship with them, they're way more amenable to getting treatment. And what I mean by treatment initially is medication. I've had people like not give me any pushback if they're in the hospital against their will. They don't, everything's a no, right? Because they're pissed. They don't want to be there. And it's really been a game changer. And we've been starting them on the long-acting injectable, which I really think is key. I mean, not everyone will either tolerate, there's about 3 or 4 different ones. And not everyone will tolerate that, but I really would like to see the primary care and psychiatric communities, especially when it comes to people who are in and out of homelessness, in and out of jails, or having frequent setbacks with taking their medications, to be on these long-acting injectables. Just anecdotally, it really has been a game changer. And people that wouldn't even accept water, a pair of socks, but they're okay with, I just happened to ask this guy, I'm like, do you want to go back on your risperidone? And he's like, okay. And so, we made it sure that he got the oral medication similar to risperidone for a couple of weeks. He did fine on it. And I said, do you want the shot version? And he's like, okay. And so he's been on the shot version for almost a year, and it's been a 180. So there are, I know I'm not giving a lot of resources regarding to how we deal with police involvement, but some of the things that we are working on is trying to get the medical community to really be savvy with antipsychotics and not just rely on psychiatrists to be treating them, because there's just not enough of you guys. So we really need to, and especially on the street, for all of LA County, there's one, street psychiatrist. So, so that's one thing. The other thing is policy, which is a lot more difficult to change, especially California rules, especially against the LPS law, has not changed in over 50 years. And the bills have been coming up in the state. They have been coming up. The most recent one that Santiago and Stern wrote is on hold. And it's because we're dealing with some organizations that firmly believe that even if you're extremely psychotic and don't have the wherewithal to really make decisions for yourself, that they have the right to be homeless. They have the right to, fulfill their psychotic episodes. And I see it more as, this is someone like with cancer. Like, I wouldn't let someone just, go without cancer treatment. I would offer them all that they need. And so there is a huge chasm between medical culture and mental health culture, where if someone had a spinal cord injury, we would have no problem treating them in a long-term rehab for months. That's all paid for by Medicaid or Medicare. But long-term psychiatric treatment not paid for by Medicaid and Medicare. So those are some of the things that my team has been working on. And I'm sure there's more, but I'm kind of just speaking the fly of my seat right now. So appreciate any questions.
Thank you, Susan. So an example of, again, of one, it's overwhelming what we're facing here. And this is an example of sort of one effort, right? Of really not abandoning people who are suffering out on the street. I think Neil Gong recently wrote an op-ed calling this system a Frankenstein's monster by mating civil libertarianism with austerity, right? We're giving people the right to be homeless and die on the street. Great.
Exactly.
That's what America's all about. So neoliberal America. So thanks, Susan. I think we've got a lot to return to in the discussion with that. I'd like to turn it over to our next speaker, Eunisses Hernandez.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'd like to start off by, telling Leticia and Christina and Maria, just thank you for taking the time to be with us and talk about your experiences and your loved ones. And also recognizing that after we leave this space, it's gonna be a hard day, and just sending you a lot of love and support, and echo what Diana said, and that, hopefully, I'm trying to say it correctly, that they rest and rise within our ancestors and in all the work that we do, so that, this doesn't keep happening. But just thank you for letting me join you. I'm Eunisses Hernandez. I live in LA County. I work with La Defensa and work with Mark Anthony. I have the privilege of working with Mark Anthony and Diana Zúñiga and a lot of folks in this space, and trying to build out, this decentralized system of care and alternatives to incarceration that we imagine. Mark Anthony and Diana and a lot of the folks on the call gave a lot of history on, what we've done in LA County and shifting away from, the county has an ethos of care first, jails last, but for us, it's care first, jails never. And it's also talking about non-carceral options for services, right? We keep trying to force people into boxes, and that hasn't worked for decades. And so in understanding that when we build out the system, that it has to take into account the needs of everyone in that way. But, we've worked on stopping the $3.7 billion jail contract that Diana was talking about, the 2 jails, a mental health jail and a women's jail. The population has decreased by over 5,000. Over 6,000 people in the LA County jail system are there pre-trial, meaning they haven't even been convicted. They're just there because the system won't let them out. Half of the women in the LA County jail system are there pre-trial, and they haven't been convicted. They're there because the system won't let them out. And so when we talk about how we move forward, that's what I'm going to talk about Measure J in a minute. But all of these things that we have been pushing for, we kind of like to see it on the big level. Look, if we're going to stop jail expansion, then we can't just target it from one end of oh yeah, let's just close down the jail. But we have, actually have to build out the examples, such as the Alternatives to Incarceration report that Diana and Mark Anthony both talked about. That's the roadmap. How do we end our reliance on jails? How do we end, cops coming to, having cops respond to, moments of crisis that? Those are recommendations within the Alternatives to Incarceration report. But just we live in a system that is really heavily influenced by colonialism, racism, and also racial capitalism. That's where we're at, where we have, these plans of yes, let's close the jail. This is the roadmap. But it's the money. And so this is why Measure J came up. It came up because we had been fighting for years around, calling for what community needs, which is investments, but also we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the millions of people that have marched. When the loss of life happened, when state sanctioned violence took, Breonna Taylor's life, George Floyd's life, that really created an opportunity for all of this to come to fruition in the forefront. Yes, cops shouldn't be at the forefront of responding to crisis or being at the forefront of getting our dollars. So Measure J was born out of that last year. It's an initiative that was on the LA County ballot in November that says 10% of locally generated tax dollars should go to 2 buckets. One is alternatives to incarceration, such as community-based pretrial services, such as mental health, behavioral health services, but based in community. And then the second bucket is investing in small businesses, Black-owned businesses, to support the capital, the building of the capital infrastructure of these buildings, right, that we imagine as being a part of a decentralized system of care. So that right now, if you think about where could I take someone who has a mental health need or is going through a crisis, there's not many places to go. And so when I mean decentralized system of care, when we say that, it's everybody throughout the county would be able to have a place for someone to go if they needed services. And so that's what Measure J invested into 2 buckets. The biggest caveat in there is that, you know, we had seen how money had come from the federal level, the state level, always tied to law enforcement, even though the money is destined for social services. And so with Measure J, we wrote in there that no part of the carceral system or agencies or departments could get any of that money. So the sheriffs can't touch it, the judges can't touch it, prosecutors can't touch it. And this is the critical part, because although we have a lot of policies at the table, like we haven't had the money to make it happen. And now that we have been able to pass a measure at the county level, which over 2 million LA County voters voted for, we still see the system trying to remain the same. It's not trying to transform. It's not trying to move the dollars, even though the voters have said, hell yeah, like move our tax dollars into these priorities. And so right now we're in the phase of implementation, where we're trying to push the county, the chief executive office in particular, to move and look and find those dollars. The sheriff in LA County gets 1 out of every 5 of our local tax dollars, and their budget at the county level is $3.3 billion. You know, out of our tax dollars, out of that same bucket that the sheriffs get 1 out of 5, only 230 million out of that whole bucket goes into supporting the services that we want. Only 230 million out of $8.8 billion in that locally generated tax bucket. And so I know I'm giving a lot of numbers and it probably doesn't sound very interesting, but like this is the critical part, because we've accomplished so much, but the racial capitalistic system is still trying to prevent us from implementing it. So we've had to find alternate ways of moving dollars. And, you know, Diana talked about AB 109 realignment. We've since 2011, LA County has gotten millions of dollars annually. The most recent, I think, was over $330 million in AB 109 money. 80% of that goes to the sheriffs and probation, even though those dollars are destined for social services and community-based organizations. So just when we talk about making it happen, it's unfortunately because of what the capitalistic system that we're stuck in, like it is about moving dollars to, but I can definitely add on, but I want to pass it back to, because I know that there's a lot of questions in there. I hope we can get to, especially around houselessness and how it's tied in. Measure J, the last thing I'll say is it's unique that not only are we talking about folks who are working on criminal justice issues or abolition, but it's a spectrum of folks who are part of that coalition. So folks working on houselessness crisis, folks who are doing street medicine, folks working on street vendor issues, all of us came together and de-siloed ourselves in that moment to push the system to move dollars into our communities. And just, yeah, thank you so much for allowing me to share space with you all. And I really look forward to the questions as well.
Great, thank you, Eunisses. And why don't all our panelists come on screen now and we can begin our discussion. And, you know, to get started, we do have a number of questions already posted, but I want to give panelists a chance to respond, to address each other. If there's anything, you know, so much was brought up. There's so much we could say, but I just kind of want to give everyone a chance to address each other or ask each other questions before we kind of open it up to questions from the audience.
Leticia, you're muted.
Sorry.
I just want to say how moved I was by your story. Like I can't not cry thinking about it, to be honest with you. I just don't know what to say. I'm just so sorry that you had to suffer that loss. And I really want to, if it's okay with you, I'd like to share your story with my colleagues and friends, just so I think it's really important to like really understand how it feels to have a loved one who suffers mental illness. And even if he didn't get murdered, it would have been so heartbreaking, but the fact that he was murdered was just unfathomable. And it's just, you know, it's just, I'm just so sorry. And I'm really glad that I got to meet you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But yes, please share his story. That is our mission, to get his story out there as much as possible. So we're constantly promoting him, constantly promoting his page, because he's one in thousands. And our hope is that there will be no more, but unfortunately after him, there was so many more. And have been and continue to be.
There's a lot to be said. One of the things that I think would be important, mental health system and the policing, is that obviously they're not trained to de-escalate mental situations in a crisis, and they should not be called. We had no other recourse to call because the pet team was already closed, and they diverted us to the police department, which then forced us in the crisis to do what we were told. And so had we known that, we wouldn't have never called. And when Christina mentioned about him being in medical care in September, the way that these mental health professionals in the pet team handled that call was very much different, because they did work with him, they did help him. And the ironic thing is that the only way he accepted to go to get seen was because he wanted to make sure that the police department, the sheriffs, were here protecting us. So the clinician that came that day, there was two of them, they came and they actually called the Pico Rivera police station, which is the ones that murdered him, and told him what was happening. We were in a pet crisis situation. They actually came, they played the role, we let them know what was going on, and they told him, you know, make him think that you're going to stay with the family and that you're going to protect him, because this is what he's asking for. So the sheriffs actually played the role, and he himself walked himself into the ambulance, let himself be taken and, you know, get the help.
Right.
And once they took him in the ambulance, well, then of course they left. But that's how, you know, serious this is when you have the correct people to come out and work with them and de-escalate a situation and try to get them help. And like the clinicians kept on saying, it's real to you. We understand this is real to you. What you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you're afraid of is real to you. And that's why we want to get you help. Unlike the person that came that day, she never bothered to talk to him, never bothered to say, hey, Marco, how are you? You know, what's going on? And so two different people, same mental health department, but treated completely differently. One was successful in helping him out. Unfortunately, the judge overruled the request from the doctors. And the other one just was more interested in knowing his background, which had no relevance to what was going on at that moment.
You know, I think Marco's story really kind of crystallizes a lot of the huge issues that were brought up on the panel. You know, again, history of racism and police violence and incarceration, history of disinvestment from mental health treatment, right? And so I'd like, sort of considering that, I'd like to kind of ask the panel, you know, what you know, financial investments should the LA County Board of Supervisors be making right now? I mean, obviously there's a lot to be done. There's many levels we should be working at, but if we could, you know, what should we be telling the Board of Supervisors to be doing at a county level right now?
Yeah, I can share a little bit. So our coalition, through the Reimagine LA coalition, created the Care First budget. And so the Care First budget has about 5 demands. The first demand is to close Men's Central Jail and reduce it by $5,000, capture the cost savings so that actually goes into care as opposed to back into law enforcement. Even though we've reduced it by 5,000 during COVID, it is increasing back to what it used to be, which was at any given day, 17,000 people would be incarcerated in the LA County jails. So again, our first demand is to close Men's Central Jail, capture those savings. Our second one is to fully fund Measure J. So that means $900 million, not the $100 million that they're trying to give the community right now. The third one is fund the Care First budget, which altogether the community calculated how much it would cost for the community-based recommendations to be funded. And that's about $2 billion. So give the community this down payment of $2 billion to really be able to generate this community-based system of care that helps us to intervene. And then the fourth one is to fully fund Youth Justice Reimagined. The youth were promised $75 million to create an office. And in this year's budget, there's no $75 million for the young people. And then the fifth one is, really authentically engage in community engagement, integration, participatory budgeting, and power sharing. This means that when the money is given to the community should have control over it. And that could mean that third-party administrators allow us to figure out how to divide up that money equitably across our community, as opposed to the county continuing to make the decisions for us. So I'll put the Care First budget in the chat so folks have access to it, but those are our 5 demands right now.
Nice.
Thanks, Diana. So those are great. Those are sort of, county level, these big policy level recommendations that you guys and groups, and advocates have been working on for years. So it's amazing that we have these asks ready, right? This has been going on. So I'd like to also ask, sort of again, going back to sort of the level of people and families, the panel about, what is I'm curious, Cristina, Leticia, and Maria, if you could have asked for any kind of care that you didn't receive, that your loved ones didn't receive, that you guys didn't receive, what kind of care do you wish you were getting that you weren't getting? And sort of in a broader picture, what is the role of medications, of hospitals, and of other forms of care? As a psychiatrist, I think, and people have posted on the chat, we don't have enough services that exist, and we should have many more services that don't exist. Just hospitals and medications is not enough. So I'm curious, from the family perspective, from clinician perspectives, what kinds of care are you guys, would you guys like to see?
It's difficult because I also have struggled with my middle daughter. She has a history of being diagnosed as severely depressed. So even with her, it took a minute to get her on the right medication. Right. But I can't emphasize enough, if the person dealing with the mental illness does not have family advocating for them, they are pretty much a loss. And mind you, we were advocating for Marco. Yeah. And he still ended up the way he did. But I feel a lot of this medication, sometimes there's issues with it because they're not being properly diagnosed. They're not being heard by the right people. So the diagnosis is often off. I remember when my daughter started her medication, she was 13, and they gave me the black box warning where they said she's already struggling with suicidal ideation. This is going to up that. So she needs to be under watch. I chose to walk away from my job because I said, at this point, who's going to be watching her?
Right.
And I didn't want to lose my daughter. And then the other day it hit me. I'm working and I'm thinking all the times my daughter was hospitalized. She was put on a 51-54 times. Me and Marco went through that together. Mm-hmm. She was going through so much. We were fearful of losing her. We called the cops all those times. We didn't know, and it hit me, and I'm working and I'm thinking, my God, we could have lost her the way we lost Marco. Yeah. And then I'm thinking, what message did that give to her as she's holding her father's head and his blood's all over her hands? If God forbid she's ever in an episode, what message is that sending it to her, that this could potentially happen to her? And she's the one who has 2 children. So what would become of her babies?
You'll never want us to call.
No, and I would never want to call again. So I would say, I feel like just like with law enforcement and how the push has been to abolish the police, I feel like there has to be a total uprooting of the whole system as a whole when it comes to mental health. And it's very difficult if you haven't been through it, if you haven't experienced having a loved one go through it, because I feel like sympathy isn't enough. Education isn't enough. It's having that empathy and really looking at this person, not just as another number or not just as another ticket for some kind of money. I don't know, because I feel like along the way it just all got lost where the focus was on with pharmaceuticals and how much medication can be issued out, and it became about politics, and all this funding went to, well, let's get bonuses or let's give raises, and they all got lost in that shuffle of being hungry for money, where it may have started out like the focus is and our heart is for patients. They got lost, and now what about these patients? Who's helping these patients? Because it was hard to see Marco the way he was, and how the dosage on the medications that they were giving him, and for him to be crying saying, I'm drooling at the mouth. It reminded me of the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I don't know if you guys have all seen it.
Classic.
Yes, it's a classic movie, but it's just heartbreaking to see, because it's like they're treated like lab rats. Well, let's figure out, let's give this dosage. If it doesn't work, then we'll just drop it a little bit. But it's like, are you really taking the time? Are you really taking the time and the effort to figure out what is going on with them? There's just so much there. And also, it would be great if support was given to the families, because you deal with so much. You take the weight of it, and it's like, I understand I don't have letters behind my name. I didn't go to school for this, but you learn firsthand, and sometimes you know a lot more than a professional, because you're dealing with this day in and day out. There was times I'd sit out with my husband because he was under the impression that his friends were after him and they were going to call the cops, so we do stakeouts, and okay, babe, let's go.
Yeah.
You know, because the more you tell them, no, nothing's happening, no, nothing, it angers them, because again, it's real to them.
Right.
You know, I gotta say, you guys are experts, and we need to respect your expertise. I mean, everything you're saying, you've learned so much, and you've been doing so many things right. You did so many things right.
Right.
Right, just there. You joined him where he was, and you said, I'm going to join you and I'm going to care for you in a way that shows you I'm hearing you and I respect what you have to say. And that's what we need to do as a system, right? Our medications are limited. They can help with some things, but they're limited. You know, inpatient hospitalization can help with some things, but it's also limited, right? And so there are other models of care out there, you know, in addition to these, and those are what we really need to start bringing up and developing. But I just want to kind of point out that part of what we need to do is acknowledge and respect and work with that expertise that you guys have. And I just wanted to read out, Maria did post a comment in the chat. I believe that Nick should have been on continuous hospitalization. I wish they had more affordable programs and more support from the system for those seeking help. It's so hard for someone to admit they have a problem and beg for help. So again, exactly right.
Yes, it is hard.
There aren't even enough in the imperfect system we have. There aren't even enough resources for people. And so we need sort of therapeutic places for people to stay that don't feel like jails, that don't feel like jail cells, but a safe place to stay when you're in crisis. Respite centers that are run by peers, right? But by people who've been through mental illness and don't force you to do anything. You know, there's a few of those in the country. Is that a model we should look at for an alternative and in addition to inpatient hospitalization? Joel, I see you have your hand up.
Oh, I just wanted to reinforce exactly what Leticia was saying, is that what it seems to me is that we really need, and from her, learn from her experience and see that serious mental illness is much more than just a biological phenomenon, but we need to reconceptualize serious mental illnesses involving an individual's relationship with others and their social world. And a consequence of that is having to acknowledge that medications are at times useful, but they certainly aren't solving the problem, and that we really need to reconceptualize what counts as treatment and put resources into the social and psychological needs of individuals. And so I just completely agree with what Teacher was saying, and what you were saying in terms of needing to listen to the experts rather than ourselves.
Yes, Susan. And I actually want to point out we're almost up until noon. We can use this. We can stay on the Zoom afternoon. I can stay. I'm happy to stay. If people have to go, that's fine. No problem. But I think this discussion is just getting started, so I don't want to have to cut it off at noon if anyone wants to stay. So go ahead, Susan.
Oh yeah, I just want to say I have a good friend and colleague who has, and many of you know her, Carrie Morrison, who has visited Trieste, Italy, and she is working hard to convince policymakers and Department of Mental Health even that their model is the way to go. And one of the, and I won't go into the details of it, but one of the things that has always stuck with me is that when there is a mental health emergency in that city, a psychiatrist shows up, or a psych tech. And so I think when someone's out of control, you might need acute medication, a shot in the arm just to calm them down, or even there's a disintegrating pill.
Yeah.
There's something there that you can, and then of course the behavioralists who know how to de-escalate someone and know how to do what you were saying. It's like, okay, I believe you. Okay, tell me more about what your thoughts are. And the combination of having that kind of intervention, I think, is really important when we're talking about emergencies. And then as far as kind of further down the line, like I think we really need to start pushing for these enriched residential care facilities, is kind of the new term, because I've seen the inpatient hospitals. They look like a hospital, and we want them to be like, gardening and painting and, doing things that make them feel good about themselves. But in the immediate crisis, I am a proponent of the medications that can really take them from 60 to 0. I'm not saying that has to be the case 24/7, and it always is trying to figure out what's the best medication for people. And I know Joel and I have talked about this, that it's not just medications, it's also the environment and the support and the people that are surrounding them. And I think that's the Trieste model. And I'm sure Philippe can probably put up a site about that. But he also, Philippe, you asked me, one of the things that the county really is trying to do, and this is one of the things I was involved with yesterday, is they're trying to get more money for working with severely mentally ill, especially who are homeless, and treating them on the streets, getting them stabilized. But more importantly, having a place for them to go and continue their stabilization, and wherever they're at. Like some of them are like, they can go into an apartment and kind of live a quote unquote normal life, or some of them might need more support, or some of them might need to be in a semi-locked facility, or someone needs, everyone's gonna fall at different levels of needs. But that's really, we have very little places for people who need to be stabilized for a long time. And I'm not saying forever, but we really have a need for that. And that's something the Department of Mental Health for LA County anyway, is really fighting for. I mean, that's, you know, from Dr. Sharon's words, like that's something he really believes in, and is really trying to get resources for that.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. And Trieste's sort of motto is not, it's relentless negotiation, right? So they will, they use medications, of course, and they have hospitals, but they have relationships with their clients, with their patients, and they negotiate. They don't call 911 and call the cops to put handcuffs on people. They negotiate and they negotiate and they negotiate and they negotiate. And so they work with them. And that's the model, not, okay, you stop working with us, I'm gonna call the cops now. So that's a cultural shift that we need in our system. Christina and Leticia, I see you guys wanted to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that also I think a big factor with a lot of mental ill patients is that the cost of medication is up the roof. And so a lot of them cannot afford it or don't know how or where to go for help. So promoting all the different types of programs around, let's say Skid Row and other areas where they're so heavy populated with that. Any way that you can get awareness out for the people, that would be also good. One of the things that I remember from Marcos is that he didn't believe that he was sick at times. So he didn't like being told that he needed to get back on his medication because he wasn't sick. And I remember having to visit him in when he was incarcerated, and he was in a mental institution. And you know, the doctor told me, you know, you can tell them 1,000 times that their blood is red, but if they believe that their blood is blue, you're not going to convince them, no matter how many times you tell them. And that's kind of like what would happen with Marcos. We would tell him a lot of times, you know, hey, take your medication, this and that. But like Christina said, it was really hard. And each shot of Invega was $1,000.
Wow.
And so, you know, he, while he was taking that, you know, and he was being seen, that's good. But here's another thing that happens within our system and the programs is, okay, they're released and they're being taken care of for X amount of months, but then they just let go and they take off like flies. And then everybody that was overwatching them forget them and never come back. No one comes 3 months later, 6 months later, a year later to follow up and say, hey, how are you doing?
Yeah.
How can we help you? Have you had a relapse?
Right.
Is there anything that we can do for you to, you know, would you like to talk about it? You know, just anything to try to bring them back in, you know, bring in that cord and get them back in case there's anything that's going on that we didn't understand or know how to help.
Yeah, so they need a structure to keep, he needed a structure to keep him well.
Yes.
Right. When he wasn't in crisis, he doesn't, it's not just when he's in crisis that he needs an injection and a hospitalization and then he's good. He needs support to keep him well. And that's, again, what we don't have in our system. What we lack, you know, and what we need to work on is something in between, you know, hospitalization and nothing. Right.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think you eloquently said that.
Yes.
Just then. So I think I want to sort of, Felipe Findley is posting some great questions, and Felipe, we haven't asked them. Felipe is a healthcare provider and an activist, and his question is, you know, he's, well, I'll just read his question. I think what Christina brings up is so poignant and should really shape our outlook, even if we successfully win all of the money and policy demands. I work in healthcare, yet the racist, sexist, homophobic, anti-working class, competitive, et cetera, shapes the culture. That system of care has so much of the same thinking within the police, except we are not armed. So simply moving money around and building these institutions, which were built all over the country following urban uprisings in the 60s, we should have an analysis of these successes and failures to shape what we aim to be building. how can we build, new institutions, even under the best intention, when racial capitalism is still functioning and shapes, downstream outcomes eventually. And so he was asking, I think he asked earlier, and with that question, he's asking, we're talking about reshaping our current systems, and what else, sort of more broadly, should and can we be doing?
And I think this is like a really good place to talk about the participatory budget piece, because, oh, sorry, Mark Anthony, I see you want to mute, but like, yeah, it is like there's these dollars, right? But moving them isn't going to be enough. Building new institutions isn't going to be enough, as we're seeing right now with the ATI initiative. It's an initiative, but it's not following the demands and recommendations we put in. But like, how do we break some of this racial capitalism is by getting the money directly to community. And I'll pass it to Diana if you want to talk more about that.
Yeah, I think that there's a few things. There's things that we're talking around changing, like contracting structures within government systems, so that the resources are funneled to third-party administrators that can create a more flexible way of accessing the resources from community-based organizations that haven't necessarily been able to receive funding from governments in the past. So I think that that's one kind of concrete thing. And then the other piece is the participatory budgeting piece that Eunisses brought up. PB is a process of shifting resources to the community so that the community can choose where those resources go. And I just want to say, like, examples of that are like creating a universal basic income process for people. In the ATI report, we even had a recommendation that talked about paying families who are doing this emotional labor and support work with their loved ones that have mental health and substance use needs. Like, why aren't we paying those families? So those are the types of things that we're talking about. We're attempting to shift the way that resources are being distributed so that it's centered in community, and then shifting the mechanisms that are being used, because the county infrastructure contracting processes do not make it easy for small mom and pop organizations to be able to access those monies, yet they're the ones that are answering these calls when the PSRT teams are not answering us, when the MET teams are not answering us, and when the PET teams are not answering us. So I'll just leave it at that. And I don't know, Mark Anthony, if you had something else to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, and I agree with everything Eunisses and Diana said, and Felipe, I always appreciate how you point us in the direction of thinking about systemically what are the limitations of this current system, and which is why I believe what we're pushing for is one prong of a very comprehensive strategy, right? And it has taken so much effort just to get this prong, to gain some ground on this prong, right? But the piece that I think when we talk about like this, a different vision, different infrastructure that we need, I really do ground myself in the idea that relationships are infrastructure, right? And the really brilliant experiments that are being done, like CAT 911, like the Dignity and Power Now Building Resilience team, like a tremendous work that Youth Justice Coalition is doing, where folks are like, we are just not going to call the police, and we're going to figure it out, and we're going to experiment, and we're just going to keep figuring it out. And those things have to be done and scaled up and learned from while we're doing all these things, because these things are going to inherently have limitations. And so, yeah, I think there's some really important work that's already moving from that principle that I think this question is rooted in. And I think we have to continue to lift those up as well.
Yeah, and this relates to one of the other questions. I think the idea that we need to be working, like you said, Mark Anthony, on reforming our mental health system, our system of care, as one prong of this greater effort to reform society, right? And again, centering racial capitalism. And so one of our comments and questions, in study after study, it's proven the majority of individuals experiencing homelessness have neither mental illness nor substance abuse disorders, right? But they're driven into homelessness due to economic and structural inequities. So homelessness, right? And there are those individuals in Skid Row with serious mental illness who need care to help them out. But the majority of homeless individuals are there due to economic and other structural reasons, not due to medical reasons. And so there's a concern about expanding involuntary hospitalizations and medicating individuals on the street, and the use of law enforcement as the means to address homelessness, right? Rather than sort of some of these broader ways, which, like Deanna, like you said, a basic income grant, or what about stuff like decommodifying housing, right? And making housing a right. And so what about, I don't know if you guys, anyone on the panel wants to sort of comment on sort of those efforts specifically regarding homelessness. I know a lot of our discussion has been around mental health and mental illness.
I'll just say, and I apologize, team. I have to go, but I just want to say I think this conversation is so critical, and I feel really moved by everyone in this conversation, and particularly you, Leticia, and Christina, and Maria. Every time I hear you speak, I just feel called and centered on the North Star where we need to go. And so just thank you. But I think the starting place for me in this conversation is that we're approaching this with an abolitionist frame, right? What are the things we need to build that we won't have to tear down later? Making sure we're not leaving people behind, and are we fundamentally shifting power, right? For me some of those tests for the things that we need to think about moving. And care in itself, the framework of care, the framework of public health, is not an abolitionist framework, but I think it's an important framework that creates more opportunity than punishment does to win abolitionist demands. And so relying on care alone is not going to do it, right? And I think this is where we get to this broader question. I think some of those other things you named, Ippy, are part of the exciting opportunities we have in LA and are necessary in LA for us to be making these connections around. And so I just really appreciate the nuance of this conversation and the vision that it asked us to do.
Yeah, Mark Anthony has to go, and I really want to respect everyone's time and energy. People have brought so much heart and so much, just so much of themselves to this. I don't want to kind of burn folks out. So why don't we wrap up? Does anyone have any sort of final comments before we wrap up?
I just have two real quick ones. Leticia, Christina, Maria, this is my first time meeting you. But if there's anything that we can do as organizations to support you all in your fight and in the fight for your family, like let us know. Like, is it grants? Is it is it because sometimes it could be that. So please, I'd love to follow up, but also, a lot of the things that we're discussing right now are literally just things that are on black and white on paper and could be changed with a decision. And right now, for example, the example that Christina brought up of families getting supported, like with stipends, and that Diana brought up, like that's already a recommendation. All we need is a political will for them to move the money to support families. So this is not like we're far away from these things. It's not like we don't have examples that are rooted in community and community experience. We have those, they're there. We just need them to make it happen, and to make it happen with community deciding where those resources go, like the participatory budget model. So I just like to say we're not far from this, and we're close. Like Mark Anthony said, his daughter's gonna grow up. They're gonna grow up in a world with men's central jails doesn't exist, but also hopefully she also lives in a world where you have places where you could take your loved ones. You have a number you could call where someone who has dedicated their life to supporting people will respond. Mark Anthony said something I'll never forget: creating life-affirming responses to crisis. Like that's what we should be aiming towards, so our loved ones are supported and cared. But just appreciate y'all for letting me join in on this incredible conversation. Thank you. And thank you for sharing so much.
Okay, well then, why don't we close? And again, I also want to echo, thank you, Christina, Leticia, and Maria for getting us started. I think that it was so important. And I think there's one thing I take away from today, it's really going to be your guys' stories and what you've been through. And the way remembering your stories really highlights all the areas we have to work and to improve. So thank you everybody for joining us today. I see hands up from Susan and Christina. No. Oh no, okay, those are from.
That was old.
Okay, those are old. Okay. So if no one has anything else to say, thank you so much for joining us. Again, we're going to post a recording of this panel on our YouTube site, so that's a way to share it with colleagues and friends who weren't able to come today. And just want to thank everybody for joining us. Thank everybody for what they're doing, and let's keep working together, everyone.
Can you give us your website and your YouTube site? please?
Yeah, can we, yeah, let me get that. I'll post that right now before we end. And then it'll
Or
be,
just email it to all of us?
yeah, when I'll post it. I think I have it on this.
Well, everyone's off.
Well, you'll get it. You'll get it. Yeah, I think we can email it, but let me give it to you, Susan. Let me give it to you, Susan.
Okay.
I just want to say thank you very much from the bottom of our hearts to giving us the opportunity to be on this forum and to be able to share the part that's so vulnerable for us to share and to publicly let people know what we've been through on the private portion of our home.
Right.
And it's not an easy subject for many of us. It's not an easy subject for those who unfortunately don't support us because they, a lot of people will take judgment before knowing the real facts and the real stories. And so it makes it really difficult to do this and sit here. But thank you very much. It's been a very good panel, a very good opportunity for us to be with you guys, and for you guys to share your space with us means a lot.
Yes.
So
And
thank you.
thank you, Susan. I saw your email for my daughter, so I'm gonna screenshot. That way I keep the info.
I think we've all learned something here today, and hopefully there will be more to come for the future generations and our communities and our counties that need the help, not just LA County, but Riverside. We have a friend that unfortunately I put it in the chat, and he's facing a life sentence and suffers from mental illness. And his mom is trying to find everything that she can that the law will help her and that she can turn to. So if there's anyone that you guys have any resources for this mom who is literally suffering on her own and trying to advocate for her son, and every time that she goes, he keeps on being turned away to just stay incarcerated for being mentally ill.
Yes.
It is a shame that our government, our counties and officials are not doing the proper thing to help this gentleman out. So,
and she shared with us too that the night they showed up, that she's crying, because they're taking her son away, and that the cop turned and looked at her and he said, "Why are you crying? You're lucky I didn't kill him, because that's what I intended to do when I came."
Wow.
And they're really like trying to keep him in there. We don't know. Yeah, this is Riverside. We don't know the details, but we do know she stated he's facing 25 to life, and he was trying to take his own life. And the judge, my mother-in-law, shared with me that she shared with her, the judge basically told her, "This is your fault for lack of not getting your son the proper care," even though she advocates for him all the time prior to this happening. And she shared that she was close to hospitalizing herself because she's taking this so hard.
Yeah, that's inappropriate.
Yeah.
Sorry.
thank you very much. I mean, there's a lot of families that need you guys.
Yes.
Well, thank you. I mean, thank you for your courage, and you've taught us a lot. And I'm serious. I really think you guys are experts at caring for someone who's suffering, from mental illness, and I think we have a lot to learn from you, and we should all be working together, to support you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And families who are facing something
Bye.
similar.
Have a good day.
God bless you guys. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.